28 Days Later is one of the most terrifying zombie films ever made, but it's also one of the most scientifically broken. From impossible biology to survival mistakes that would get you killed in hours, this movie falls apart the second you start asking questions. So today, we're breaking down everything 28 Days Later gets wrong about survival, starting with the thing that makes zero sense from the opening scene, the infection speed. The rage virus transforms a human being into a hemorrhaging, screaming, mindless killing machine in 10 to 20 seconds. That's faster than you can tie your shoes. And it is completely, hilariously impossible. Here's the thing. A real virus needs time to work. It has to infiltrate your cells, hijack the replication machinery, start copying itself, and then trigger enough of an immune response for you to actually feel sick. COVID takes 2 to 14 days. Influenza needs 1 to 4 days minimum. Even Ebola, one of the most aggressive hemorrhagic viruses on the planet, and the exact virus the rage virus is supposedly derived from, has an incubation period of 2 to 21 days before a single symptom shows up. But the rage virus does it in 20 seconds. 20. And the neurological changes alone make this laughable. The film depicts full behavioral collapse, brain inflammation, and hemorrhaging. For that to happen, the virus would need to cross the blood-brain barrier, replicate inside neural tissue, and trigger cascading neuroinflammation. Fast-acting viral encephalitis, which is about as aggressive as real brain infections get, takes days to weeks, not the time it takes to microwave a burrito. But here's where it gets really fun. A virus this fast would actually defeat itself. Real viruses survive by keeping their hosts alive and mobile long enough to spread. That's epidemiology 101. The rage virus kills its host's higher brain function before they could ever board a train, catch a flight, or walk into a crowded building. It would burn through a room and then have nowhere left to go. An entire national outbreak? Impossible. The film's most iconic scare is also the exact reason its apocalypse could never happen. But if you think the speed of infection is the only thing the movie gets wrong about biology, wait until you hear what happens when you stop feeding the infected. The 28-day starvation rule. Here's the thing about 28 Days Later's most hopeful plot point. It's completely broken, and not in the way that helps anyone. The films tell us the infected will eventually starve to death because they lose the instinct to seek food. That's the light at the end of the tunnel. Just wait them out, and nature handles the rest. Sounds reasonable, right? Humans can survive roughly 1 to 2 months without food, depending on body fat reserves. So, a few months of hiding and the problem solves itself. But here's where it gets dark. Food isn't the limiting factor. Water is. The average person dies within 3 to 5 days without hydration. That's it. Your kidneys start failing, your organs shut down, and you're done. The starvation clock is almost irrelevant when dehydration kills you 10 times faster. Now, look at the infected. Really look at them. These things are constantly hemorrhaging from their eyes and mouth. They're vomiting massive volumes of blood. Every single encounter shows them losing catastrophic amounts of fluid with zero intake to replace it. That level of ongoing fluid loss doesn't give you weeks. It doesn't give you months. It gives you days. Acute kidney failure would set in within a week, maybe 2 at the absolute outside. The infected wouldn't slowly waste away over months like the films suggest. They'd collapse in under 2 weeks, and that creates a genuinely absurd contradiction. The timeline the survivors cling to as their hope for rescue is actually way too generous. The real math says the infected should be dying far faster than anyone in the film realizes, which sounds great, except it also means the outbreak couldn't have spread across all of Britain in the first place. You can't overrun an entire nation when your army is biologically incapable of surviving longer than a couple weeks. The filmmakers eventually figured this out. It just took them 23 years. 28 years later, quietly retcons the whole thing by giving the evolved infected the ability to eat and drink, which is basically an admission that the original biology never worked. Better late than never, I guess. But if you think the starvation math is the only thing the film's botched, wait until we talk about what happens when infected blood actually lands on you. The deserted London logistics. Let's talk about the most iconic scene in the entire film. Jim wakes up, walks out of that hospital, and wanders through a completely empty London. Westminster Bridge, Piccadilly Circus, Parliament, not a single person. And yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous filmmaking. Danny Boyle shot those scenes at dawn on real London streets, and they're haunting. But they're also completely impossible. London is a city of 8 million people. 8 million. And the film wants you to believe that every single one of them just vanished in 28 days, leaving behind pristine, undamaged streets with barely a sign of struggle. No abandoned cars clogging intersections, no makeshift barricades, no broken windows from looting, no blood, just silence and litter. Here's the thing. If millions of people simultaneously became hemorrhaging, violent aggressors, the city wouldn't look empty. It would look destroyed. There would be vehicles abandoned mid-road from people fleeing, storefronts smashed open, evidence of mass panic everywhere. The London we see in the film looks like everyone politely relocated on a bank holiday, not like a city torn apart by a rage virus. And then there's the infrastructure problem that nobody talks about. Modern power grids don't just shut off when workers stop showing up. They're built with redundancy, fail-safes, and cascading protection systems specifically designed to keep running during emergencies. The 2003 Northeast blackout knocked out power to 55 million people across the US and Canada, and even that wasn't a total collapse. It was traced and corrected. Yet in the film, London goes completely dark in under a month. Britain maintains military command structures and emergency continuation protocols that operate independently of civilian government. NATO has similar systems. These don't dissolve in 28 days. Emergency broadcasts, skeleton infrastructure crews, and military chain of command would all still be active and functioning. The idea that every system simultaneously fails is the real fantasy here, not the virus. The film also completely ignores what happens to water treatment facilities, refrigeration infrastructure, and fuel distribution. All of these run on automated or skeleton crew systems designed to keep functioning during exactly this kind of crisis. They don't need a full workforce. They need a handful of trained people and backup generators. The boring truth about critical infrastructure is that it's specifically engineered to be resilient, which makes for terrible horror but excellent survival odds. The scariest part of that opening sequence is actually the least realistic part of the entire movie. But if empty streets seem hard to believe, wait until you hear about how the film handles what happens when infected blood gets on your face. The blood splatter immunity. This one is the most frustrating entry on the list because the movie is so close to getting it right and then completely fumbles at the finish line. 28 weeks later introduces the idea that someone can carry the rage virus, show zero symptoms, and still infect others. Don Harris kisses his wife, who's been carrying the virus symptom-free this entire time, and immediately gets infected. It's framed as this terrifying twist that nobody saw coming. And here's the thing. Asymptomatic transmission is a real phenomenon. It genuinely happens. But the way this film uses it breaks its own rules. Let me explain. For Dawn's wife to transmit viable virus through her saliva, she'd need to be shedding it at infectious levels. The same virus that causes catastrophic hemorrhaging in every single other infected person is somehow doing absolutely nothing to her vascular system. That's not how this works. The rage virus doesn't have a quiet mode. Every other case we've seen involves blood pouring from the eyes, violent convulsions, and complete behavioral collapse within seconds. You can't have a virus that does all of that and then also just politely hangs out in someone's saliva at high enough concentrations to infect on contact. Real asymptomatic carriers exist with viruses like HIV and certain strains of COVID-19, but those are microbes that evolved a quiet coexistence with their host. They persist in bodily fluids at low levels without triggering a severe immune response. That's a fundamentally different relationship than what the rage virus has with human biology. The rage virus is a sledgehammer. It doesn't do subtle, but here's the kicker. The film treats this asymptomatic carrier situation like it's some unbeatable loophole that defeats quarantine entirely. Like nobody could have possibly planned for this. Except we literally dealt with this exact scenario during COVID-19. Mass testing, quarantine of exposed individuals, regardless of symptom status, contact tracing. These protocols exist precisely because asymptomatic spread was a known possibility. A NATO-coordinated quarantine of an entire country would absolutely account for silent carriers. That's not a gap in modern epidemiology. That's day one planning, the immunity plus infectiousness combination the film proposes, where someone's immune system suppresses every symptom but still allows massive viral loads in saliva, is an incredibly narrow biological window. Real viruses almost never occupy that space. You either fight off the virus or you don't. The middle ground of completely fine but extremely contagious with a virus, this aggressive, is essentially science fiction. And the worst part? The movie had a genuinely interesting idea. Asymptomatic carriers are terrifying in real outbreaks. But instead of exploring how real quarantine protocols would adapt, the film just uses it as a cheap plot device to restart the infection. The scariest version of this story is one where the protocols work perfectly and the virus still finds a way through. That's real horror. ever. What we got instead was a kiss of death scene that falls apart the second you think about it. But if asymptomatic carriers sound like a stretch, wait until you hear about the film's approach to military rescue operations, because that might be the single most unrealistic thing in the entire franchise. The expired gasoline problem. Every cool car chase in this franchise is a lie, not because of the stunts or the cinematography, but because of basic fuel chemistry that the films completely ignore for over 20 years. Throughout the 28 Days Later films, survivors find abandoned vehicles on London streets and just drive them. Turn the key, engine fires up, off they go. Nobody checks the fuel. Nobody sniffs the tank. Nobody even asks the question. And here's the thing, in a real post-apocalyptic timeline, that question becomes the most important one you can ask within months of society collapsing. Gasoline degrades. It's not like water sitting in a bottle. It actively breaks down through three main mechanisms, and all three would be hammering every abandoned car in London simultaneously. First, oxidation. Oxygen reacts with the hydrocarbons in fuel, breaking them down into peroxides, aldehydes, and acids. These compounds thicken into a gummy residue that clogs fuel lines, injectors, and filters. Your engine doesn't just run poorly, it doesn't run at all. Second, evaporation. The lighter, more volatile components in gasoline, the stuff that actually makes it easy to ignite, escape over time. What's left behind is heavy, sluggish fuel that your engine struggles to combust. Third, water contamination. Condensation builds inside fuel tanks exposed to temperature swings, and if the fuel contains ethanol blends, that water causes phase separation. You get a layer of water sitting at the bottom of the tank, corroding everything it touches. Properly sealed, clean, dry storage extends gasoline viability to roughly 6 to 12 months. That's best case scenario. The abandoned vehicles sitting on London streets with open fuel caps, exposed to rain, heat, cold, and months of condensation, those tanks would degrade significantly faster. By the events of 28 weeks later, most untreated fuel in the country would be severely compromised or completely unusable. Fuel stabilizers exist specifically to prevent oxidation and microbial growth, extending shelf life to 12 months or longer. But the films show zero awareness that this is even a concern. No survivor is ever seen testing fuel quality. Nobody is treating stored fuel with stabilizers. Nobody is rationing gasoline as the finite, actively depleting resource that it is. They just find cars and drive them like it's a Tuesday afternoon. Now, credit where it's due. 28 years later does eventually acknowledge this problem. Survivors are shown struggling to locate viable fuel and ultimately running out entirely, forcing them to continue on foot. It's a satisfying correction, but it's one the franchise badly needed about 20 years earlier. But if you think bad gasoline is an overlooked survival problem, wait until you see what these films get wrong about the food sitting in every abandoned grocery store. The grocery store feast. There's this comforting image the films keep selling you. Survivors walk into an abandoned grocery store, grab what they need off the shelves, and eat like the apocalypse is just a really long camping trip. It looks almost pleasant. But here's the thing. If you actually walked into a grocery store even 2 weeks after the power grid failed, you wouldn't be grabbing dinner. You'd be walking into a biohazard. The moment refrigeration dies, and the films establish very clearly that power is gone across Britain, every cold chain section of every store becomes a rotting nightmare. Meat, dairy, prepared foods, anything from the frozen section. All of it becomes unsafe within hours of power loss. Not days, hours. Within a week, those aisles would smell so bad, you physically couldn't stand in the building. Within a month, you're looking at active bacterial colonies, mold growth across entire sections, and pest infestations that would make the infected seem like a secondary concern. Now, genuinely shelf-stable items do exist. White rice, dried pasta, canned goods, salt, sugar, cooking oils, dried beans, and lentils. These are real survival foods. But even these require specific conditions to stay viable. Cool, dry, sealed, away from moisture and pests. An abandoned grocery store weeks into a collapse has none of those conditions. You'd have moisture intrusion from broken windows and failed HVAC systems, rodents and insects tearing through compromised packaging, and temperature swings that accelerate spoilage. Canned goods can last 2 to 5 years under ideal conditions. The conditions inside an abandoned Tesco are not ideal, but the single biggest oversight isn't even about food, it's water. Nobody in these films seems remotely concerned about where they're drinking water comes from, and that's quietly one of the least realistic details in the entire franchise. Without active municipal water treatment and distribution, clean drinking water becomes your #1 survival priority. Full stop. Dehydration kills faster than starvation. The average person can survive weeks without food, but only 3 to 5 days without water. And contaminated water doesn't just fail to hydrate you, it's an active disease vector. Dysentery, cholera, parasitic infections. Drinking untreated water from abandoned taps connected to a dead municipal system could kill you faster than the infected. Yet the survivors in these films look reasonably healthy, well hydrated, and functional throughout. Nobody is boiling water. Nobody is filtering water. Nobody even mentions water. They just drink and move on like the infrastructure is still working behind the scenes. Real post-collapse survival would require transitioning almost immediately to hunting, fishing, foraging, or relying on prepositioned shelf-stable stores. The casual grocery store scavenging depicted might sustain survivors for a few weeks at best before every edible item in every reachable store is either consumed, spoiled, or contaminated beyond use. After that, you're growing food or you're starving. But if you think finding food is hard, wait until you hear how the films handle the concept of a defensible position. The mansions as fortresses. Major West's commandeered country estate is supposed to be the safe place, the military stronghold, the destination that makes the entire journey worth it. And it falls apart because one infected person gets inside. Here's the thing, that's not a dramatic twist. That's a structural audit. The mansion has 0 layered defenses, 0 internal barriers, 0 fallback positions, and 0 compartmentalization. It's a big fancy house with some soldiers in it and locked doors. That's not a fortress. That's a suggestion. Real fortification involves multiple independent systems working together. You need hardened entry points rated for forced entry, not wooden doors with deadbolts. You need clear lines of sight around the entire perimeter so nothing approaches without being seen. You need multiple egress routes so defenders can't be trapped in a single room with no way out. You need structural compartmentalization so that a breach in one zone doesn't cascade into total facility collapse. And you need stored resources, medical capability, independent power, and communication systems that don't rely on civilian infrastructure. The mansion has literally none of this. So when a single infected person gets loose inside an unpartitioned structure with no internal barriers, no secondary defensive positions, and no fallback zones, what happens? Exactly what the film shows. Total cascade failure in minutes. Every room connects to every other room. Every hallway is an attack vector. Every soldier is simultaneously exposed. The whole thing collapses like dominoes because there's nothing stopping the chain reaction. And here's where it gets embarrassing. Medieval castle designers solved this problem 800 years ago. Keeps, inner baileys, multiple defensive rings. The entire point of a castle's architecture was that a breach at the outer wall didn't mean the fortress fell instantly. You could lose the courtyard and still hold the keep. You could lose the keep's lower floors and still defend from the upper levels. Every layer bought time. Every barrier created a new decision point for the attackers. These soldiers forgot all of it, or never learned it. The personnel problem makes it even worse. A dozen soldiers cannot meaningfully defend a large multi-room mansion against any sustained threat. Real military installations use structural hardening and defensive positioning specifically because manpower is always finite. You can't post guards at every window, every door, every hallway intersection of a sprawling estate. The math doesn't work, so you harden the structure itself to compensate. Steel-reinforced door frames, ballistic barriers, compartmentalized zones that can be sealed independently. You make the building do the work that people can't, but Major West's crew just locked the front door and called it a day. The dramatic irony is almost too perfect. The place that's supposed to represent safety and military competence is tactically terrible, and the film accidentally proves it by having the entire operation collapse from a single internal breach. It's not bad luck, it's bad planning. The mansion was never a fortress. It was a death trap with nice furniture. But if you think the fortification failures are bad, wait until we talk about the film's grand rescue finale, because the military logistics somehow get even worse. The fighter jet rescue. The final image of 28 Days Later is genuinely beautiful. Jim, Selena, and Hannah standing on a hillside, waving a massive fabric SOS signal as a fighter jet streaks across the sky above them. It's hopeful, it's earned, and it is a complete fantasy that contradicts everything the film spent 2 hours establishing. Let me explain. The aircraft in that scene is a Hawker Hunter. That's a single-seat jet attack aircraft. Military aircraft do not freelance. A pilot on a reconnaissance pass does not independently decide to redirect rescue operations because they spotted some bedsheets on a hill. Any action that pilot takes requires explicit authorization through command channels. period. But let's say the pilot wanted to help. Here's the thing. Jets cannot conduct personnel recovery. You cannot rescue people with a fighter aircraft. Rescue requires helicopters with hoisting equipment, trained crews, and extraction protocols that take hours to coordinate. A jet seeing an SOS and arranging a rescue would need radio contact with base command, identification of available helicopter assets, route clearance through hostile airspace, perimeter security at the landing zone, and confirmation that the individuals on the ground are actually friendly and not infected using bait tactics. All of that has to happen before a single rescue helicopter even spins up its rotors. And here's where the entire scenario falls apart. Britain has been quarantined by NATO and UN forces throughout the film. That's not a minor plot detail. That is the strategic reality of the entire movie. A rescue operation into an active biological quarantine zone for 3 unknown civilians with 0 verified health status would require strategic authorization that directly conflicts with the standing containment order. You're asking a military command structure to violate its own quarantine to extract people who might be carrying the exact virus they're trying to contain. That does not happen. Not without days of deliberation, medical screening protocols, and authorization from levels of command that a single jet pilot has 0 access to. The ending is deliberately ambiguous. The jet may not have even acknowledged the signal, but the film presents it as hopeful, as the moment where rescue finally arrives. In reality, a jet flying over an active pandemic quarantine zone is a containment patrol. That's it. The pilot's mission is to monitor the perimeter, report breaches, and return to base. 3 people waving fabric on a hillside aren't a rescue opportunity. They're a data point in a containment report, which brings us to the brutal irony of the whole movie. Jim wakes up alone, crosses a dead city, loses people, kills people, and fights his way to something that looks like safety. The entire film builds toward this single moment of salvation, and the mechanism of that salvation, a fighter jet rescue from inside a sealed quarantine zone, is the one thing in the movie that is genuinely, logistically, completely impossible under the rules the film itself established. The infection speed is exaggerated. The starvation timeline is wrong. The fuel would be degraded. The mansion fortress was a tactical joke, but all of those are at least in the neighborhood of plausible. The jet rescue isn't. It requires the military to simultaneously enforce a quarantine and violate it, to use an attack aircraft as a search and rescue platform, and to authorize an extraction that no command structure on Earth would approve without weeks of planning. 28 Days Later is a masterpiece of tension, atmosphere, and horror filmmaking. It changed the genre permanently, but if you watch that final scene and feel hope, just know that the most tactically honest version of that ending is 3 survivors waving at a jet that was never, ever coming back for them. If you enjoyed this video and want to see movies' deadliest zombies explained, click the video on the screen now.